Morning, good afternoon, good evening. I've said on this platform that Zimbabwe is a failed state. And yet, I'll be the first one to admit it is not a pleasure at all to hear it being repeated in one's face. But I'll be very foolish indeed if I was to pretend that Zimbabwe is anything other than a failed state. Here is somebody talking about Zimbabwe and why we are a failed state.
Zimbabwe is a mess. There's no doubt about it. Zimbabwe is the opposite of Botswana. Will it get any better? No. Here is the thing. You see, Zanu PF has criminalized Zimbabwean society. It has perverted it. Crime, corruption, chaos is now culture in Zimbabwe. And once something becomes culture, it is very difficult to change it. So the idea that if you want a document, a passport, for example, from a Zimbabwean government office, you will get it without paying a bribe. If you told Zimbabweans that, they would laugh at you and say you have smoked something. Because that's not how it works. In Zimbabwe, everything.
Sorry about that. Seem to have lost sound there. The tragedy is, the gentleman is absolutely right. Zimbabwe is a failed state. Zanu PF has perverted the country's political culture to the point of becoming absurd. Whether we like to admit it or not, the reality on the ground speaks for itself. It is important to understand that as much as we have got corrupt and incompetent leaders, we ourselves have been, the ordinary people have been to blame for where we are as a people. When Zanu PF got into power in 1980, the party campaign message in 1980 was that if the party does not win the election, the Bush war would continue. That should have set alarm bells ringing in every thinking Zimbabwean. The armed struggle had been about one man, one vote. And now all of a sudden, you're being told that scrap that. If you do not vote for Zanu PF, the Bush war would continue. In other words, you've lost the right to a meaningful say in the governance of the country. That should have galvanized the nation to say no. If that is the way you're going to rule, that is the last thing we want. we should have learned the most important lesson, that every time you try to appease dictators, you only make the situation worse. Because dictators, by their nature, they will demand an inch. You give them an inch, they'll take a foot. And they'll be back tomorrow demanding a yard. You give them a yard, they'll take 3 yards. And the day after, they'll be back again demanding a mile. It's just endless. And that is exactly what has happened in Zimbabwe. The gentleman is absolutely right. Zanu PF has corrupted Zimbabwe society to the point of utter helplessness. The video clip was unfortunately not playing properly, technical problems. But the gentleman went on to talk about how Zanu PF and the army have become one. I beg to differ with him there. I think the army, the police, the CIO in Zimbabwe were as professional as anywhere else you get in the world. It's Zanu PF that corrupted them. When Zanu PF wanted to secure, consolidate its hold on power, it started appointing individuals into these key institutions, and they were made to understand that their position in that institution was to advance Zanu PF selfish interests of holding on to power at all costs. When you look at some of the army commanders' statements, you realize that these people have been put under enormous pressure to say what they are saying, because it simply doesn't make any sense. Here is Commander Tsvangirai speaking on elections in Zimbabwe and why the opposition cannot be elected to high office.
We wish to make it very clear to all Zimbabwean citizens that the security organization will only stand in support of those political leaders that will pursue Zimbabwe's value, traditions, belief, for which thousands of lives were lost in pursuit of Zimbabwe's hard-won independence, sovereignty, territorial integrity, and the national interest. To this end, let it be known that the highest office on the land is a straitjacket, whose occupant is expected to observe the objectives of the liberation struggle. We will therefore not accept, let alone support or salute anyone with a different agenda that threatens very existence of our sovereignty, our country, and our people.
The sovereignty of the country, in this case here, is defined by the people. The mandate to govern the country is derived from winning the majority of the votes in a free, fair, and credible election. So if the election was free, fair, and credible, and the people voted for somebody else other than a Zanu PF leader, it's not for the army to turn around and say, no, they cannot rule. On what basis? Because they've not taken part in the liberation struggle. A country is not defined by the liberation struggle. Already we are 45 years after independence. The generation who could genuinely say they carried the gun are dying. Does that mean the country is going to die as well? What he was saying there was utter nonsense. You could tell it had been drummed into him by Zanu PF leaders who wanted to push through this mentality that only Zanu PF is the government of office. Only Zanu PF leaders can be trusted with the nation's independence and sovereignty, can be trusted with the nation's interests. And yet, if you look where we are, Zimbabwe is a failed state. Millions are living in abject poverty, including the war veterans themselves. How is that serving the national interest? Of course it's not. So the biggest problem we had here is we had corrupt, tyrannical, murderous thugs like Robert Mugabe and his cronies who went on to corrupt society. And society itself, including our war veterans in this case, were gullible and naive enough to believe the Zanu PF nonsense that only Zanu PF leaders can rule the country. It didn't stop there, unfortunately. We had the opportunity, the golden opportunity in 2008 to 2013 to implement the democratic reforms which would have completely dismantled the Zanu PF dictatorship. The opportunity to do so fell to Morgan Tsvangirai and his MDC friends. For 5 years of the GNU, they failed to implement even one token reform. Why? Because they turned out to be corrupt, incompetent, and they were easily bribed by Robert Mugabe to forget about the reforms. So we found ourselves in a situation where 5 years of the GNU were utterly, completely wasted. MDC guys failed to implement even one token reform. And at the end of it, they turned around to their supporters and told them that the MDC, CCC could still win elections, rigged elections, because they've devised ways, strategies of winning rigged elections. And the tragedy is their supporters believed it. Even when they'd been warned repeatedly that this is a lie, they still believed it. Ever since the 2013 elections, Zimbabweans have been participating in flawed elections to give Zanu PF legitimacy. Absolutely sickening. And yet that is exactly what has been happening. What is even more disappointing is that whilst one can say the rule of voters are easily intimidated by the regime, one cannot say the same about the opposition supporters. Most of their supporters are based in the urban centers, and they also command the majority of Zimbabweans in the diaspora. How is it possible that somebody with O-level qualifications and above can be so naive and gullible to believe the idiotic nonsense that the opposition can win rigged elections? Beggars belief. I beg to differ with the gentleman when he said that Zimbabwe is a lost cause. I don't think it is. I think Zimbabwe would have taken a totally different course if Robert Mugabe and his cronies, or Morgan Tsvangirai and his friends, had been the visionary leaders such as Nelson Mandela was, who would have realized the importance of making sure that the country has got rules and it's a healthy and functioning democracy. We did not have that fortune to have such visionary leaders. Still, I believe that the people of Zimbabwe can still snap out of this intellectual slumber they are in and realize that the present political system is not working, and accept the need for real, meaningful political change that will set the nation free to join the rest of the international community, so that the people of Zimbabwe and the nation at large can hold their heads high as members of the human race. At the present moment, Zimbabwe has become the textbook case to the world of a failed state. There is everything to be ashamed in that. But it doesn't have to be so. We can change it. We must change it. And I think the starting point is accepting that the present political system has failed. And for us, the ordinary people, to accept that for the last 45 years, we have been ignorant, naive, and gullible. And both Zanu PF and the opposition have taken full advantage of that to con us to do some of the most foolish things over and over again. I do not believe anyone in the army would continue to subscribe to the notion that only Zanu PF leaders are competent to rule the country. And I do not want to believe that there are still millions of Zimbabweans who believe in the idiotic lie that the opposition can win rigged elections. After 45 years of rigged elections, we need to snap out of this intellectual slumber as a people and take responsibility to define the destiny of our own country and save ourselves from the tragic human suffering that has resulted because Zimbabwe is a failed state. Food for thought. Thank you very much. Have a good day.